Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, Today we start where we left earlier, and in previous lecture, I told you about the Amokvarsh, the Rashtrakuta ruler, and the general Bankesh killed Dhruva first in the battle and continued the war with his son Akalvarsh and his grandson Dhruva II. Dhruva II was, however, threatened in his rear by the Gurjar ruler Meher Bhoj, and some of his own kinsmen has turned hostile to him at home. And he thus thought it wise to compose his quarrel with Amogars in 860 and was thereby enabled to thwart the design of the Gurjara and his hostile kinsman, so that we find him secure on his throne again in 867 AD. So, uh, here we start. And after the recall of Bangesh, the war against the rebels in the Ganga kingdom was entrusted to Gunag Vijayaditya, who led an expedition into the Kingdom as its ruler. Nolambadhiraj first, also called Mangi, and had joined the rebellion. Mangi was slain in battle, and the road to Gangavadi and opened up. Then the Ganga army was beaten in its turn, and Nitimark obliged to make peace. By temperament, Amogvash was a religious man who loved literature more than fighting. Uh, he is said to have retired from his court more than once to spend time in the company of Jaina monks. It is doubtful, however, whether he formally renounced Hinduism, though a small Jaina catechism entitled Prashnottara Ratna Malika is attributed to him. He was himself an author and a liberal patron of authors. He is also celebrated as the maker of the city of Manekher, the city built to excel that of Indra. His palace was full of fine workmanship and included an extensive apart for the royal princesses and a tank. Amokvar was succeeded by later his son Krishna II in 880 AD. So from here, the history of Chera country during this period is still obscure. Apparently, the land continued under the Perumalas, and though several rulers of different dynasties claim to have overrun Kerala, generally a vague assertion not supported by tangible evidence. We have seen that Pallava Narsingvarman first claimed victory over the Cheras, as also the Pandya Sindan. So, Nandivarman II Pallaval allied himself with the ruler of Kerala against his Pandyan contemporary, and that is Varaguna first, and the other Pallava rulers like Singh Vishnu and Nandivarman III also claimed suzerainty over the Kerala. Cultural contact between the Chera country and the Pallava court is rather well attested, and the Madhyavilas of Mahendravarman became one of the favorite theatricals in this context of the Chakyar, the hereditary play actors of Malabar. In his Avanti Sundari Katha Sar of Dandin reveals a vivid knowledge of Kerala and refers to several learned Brahmin of Keral, who visited Kanchi while he was in the Pallava court. Among the Pandyas, besides Sindans, almost every other ruler claims success against the Cheras, as do also Pulkesan II, Vikramaditya first, Vikramaditya second, and Kirtivarman second among the Badami Chalukyas, and Danti Durga. And with him Govinda third, and we also included Krishna third among the Rashtrakutas. One of the latest Perumalas of the period was the celebrated Cheraman Perumal. At the end of the 8th and early 9th century, and whose history is much overlaid by legend. We may doubt the authenticity of the story of this conversion to Islam and his pilgrimage to Makkah. but he must have been a devotedly religious man as the Jain, Christians, and Savites. Besides, Muslim claim him as one of their fold. So his relation to Sundaramurti, according to Shav legend, will be noticed later. So he may have renounced the world and effected a partition of his realm among his relatives or vassals before doing so. He seems to have vanished somehow about 825 AD, and this is the epoch of the Kollam era. But whether that era commemorates Cheraman's partition of Kerala or Shankaracharya's imposition of his religious prescriptions on that country, or the establishment of the Jews merchant community in Kollam, that is Kilon. The other possibility have also been suggested, cannot be determined yet. So there are epigraphical references which connect the era both with the appearances and the destruction of the Kollam. In concluding the political history of period, we may note that Kalinga was throughout under the rule of the line of Eastern Gangas, and who, in spite of their name, have no apparent connection in this period with the Gangas of Mysore. They dated their inscriptions in the era of their own and beginning with the equivalent of 498 AD. Their external contact were few, though sorry, yes, their external contacts were few, though sometimes the politics of the Telugu country to the south under the Vishnu Kundins and their successors. The eastern Chalukyas occasionally forced itself on their attention. So they made their submission to Pulkesan II in 620 AD. When he invaded the eastern Deccans and later perhaps also to the Rashtrakuta Dantidurg in 750 AD, but to judge from their grants, they generally led a peaceful existence without disturbing their neighbors or being troubled by them. In proceeding to sketch the polity of the period, emphasis should be laid at outset, on certain fundamental characteristics in the Indian attitude to political organization in ancient times. First, they looked to the state for very little, and the ruler was expected to uphold the existing social order and protect it from internal trouble and foreign invasions, and receive as his wage the taxes paid by the people, particularly a sixth part of the produce of the land. The social order itself has its roots elsewhere in revelation, the Shruti, the tradition Smriti, and the practice of the elite, the Akara. The ruler had ordinarily little control over the numerous social, economic, and religious concerns of the people, except by way of dispensing justice, whether disputes were brought before him or his courts. The details of the daily life of the people were looked after by the numberless autonomous groups and associations bound by ties of locality, caste, occupation, or religious persuasion. And these groups generally followed the custom and ancient practice, though they were by no means unwilling to try new methods and should occasion demanded. Each group had its own constitution, generally well understood by its members and flexible enough uh, meeting new situations. And there were usually a general assembly which met rarely, except perhaps once a year or some definite festive or ceremonial occasion, and an executive body in charge of the daily routine. So the executive was often chosen by a lot from among persons possessing certain prescribed qualifications, and the decision by majority of the votes was not unknown. But usually the aim was to reach unanimous and integrated decision by reconciling the different interests and the point of view. The guild of merchant like the Nanadesis and the Manigramam and the 500 of Ayavol associations of craftsmen, artisans and manufacturers like the braziers, oilmongers and weavers, and of the students ascetics, temple servants, priests, and so on. So, beside the territorial assemblies of the village and higher divisions, they all functioned more or less independently of the government of the ruler. Secondly, the duty of the protecting society was cast by the theory on a special class, the Kshatriyas, and by a natural and easy transition, anyone who felt equal to the task of undertaking the rule of a particular area and did not hesitate to do so was more or less readily accepted as the ruler. Each successful adventurer became a king and gained respectability by maintaining a liberal court and patronizing learning and the arts and causing prashastis, the praises also obvious, to be composed in honor of himself as his family. Moreover, aggrandizement was the recognized duty of the ruler, and he had to be a Vijigishu. A Vijigishu was the one who wishes to conquer. And the general acceptance of this ideal led to frequent wars and skirmishes, resulting in changes in the relative precedence of the different powers involved. Lastly, and as a consequence of these two factors, political changes did not have in India such profound effects on the structure of society and civilization as elsewhere. Although the establishment and the continued prosperity of an empire often indeed meant an era of high endeavor and achievement in literature and the arts. The organization, which made for the continuity of life and tradition, held society together and carried it safe through the storms and turmoils of political revolution, was the autonomous, self sufficient village. It was the primary cell of the body, politic and vitality of its institution is very attested by hundreds of inscriptions from all parts of the country. Usually, it comprised a number of families and each occupying a house of its own in the residential quarter of the village and owning its own share of the arable land and enjoying privileges like the right to graze cattle and gather firewood in the waste land and forest lying round about and held in common by the villagers as a body. So, a Pallava grant mentions some land in a village as the property of the king, which goes directly against the view sometimes expressed that all land belonged to the king in the ancient Indian state. A careful record of the boundaries of a village and of the individual estates in it was maintained. The villagers met periodically to consider matters of common concern and for the settlement of disputes and administration of justice. Everywhere, rural administration grew from timid and tentative improvisation to the more elaborate and complicated machinery of committees and officials that we find described in the Chola inscription of the 10th and 11th centuries. And in this evolution, the Tamil country appears to have been more progressive than the rest of the South India. The village had a headman variously called Mutuda, Kilan, Bhojak, and so on. So, who was its leader and mediator with the royal government, and how he was appointed and whether the office was hereditary cannot be determined. And we didn't find any kind of evidence of the process of the appointment of the head. So, the village elders are also particularly mentioned beside the headman and the assembly. From the 8th and 9th centuries AD, three types of village assemblies are traceable in Tamil inscription, and they are Ur, Sabha, and Nagaram. The Ur was the common type which included all classes of people who held the land in the village, and the Sabha was an exclusively Brahmin assembly of villages given as gift to Brahmins where all the land belonged to them. The Nagaram was the quite another type of pertaining to localities where the traders and merchants were in a dominant position. In many instances, the different types existed side by side in the same locality, and whenever necessary, there was mutual consultation among these different assemblies, and other local associations. The general rule was to consult all the interest concerned in a matter of before a decision was taken on it. The village assembly regulated irrigation rights, administered charitable endowments, maintained tank and roads, and managed the affair of the temples. Executive officers and committees working under it. It also made rules for regulating its own procedure. So in Deccan, we came across many references to the Mahajanas, also Mahajanas of villages, who were in charge of the local administration under the leadership of Gamundas. The Gamundas were the headmen. The royal official stood in closer relation to the working of the village assemblies here than in the more autonomous township of the Tamil country. Unless especially exempted, the villages were liable to visit from royal officers for digging for salt, the manufacturer of sugar, and the arrest of culprits. They also had to supply draught bulls to help the progress of touring officers, beside other amenities such as accommodations and beds, boiled rice, milk, curds, grass, fuel, and green vegetables, beside free labor on specified public works, and so on. In addition to the land tax and these occasional demands, from officials, the people were subjected to a variety of imposts, direct and indirect, and houses and professions were taxed. The market dues and tolls on merchandise moved from place to place were collected, beside judicial dues and judicial dues and fines. So the Arab writers who knew Western India well thought that the people of India were heavily taxed, so that their monarch might have their treasuries full. To complete the picture, we must note that beside these compulsory levies, central and local, a number of voluntary imposed for particular purposes, such as the maintenance of a tank, temple, feeding house, or a college or hospital, were undertaken by particular corporations, and the mostly of them are the merchants. Our the Grama was the administrative division called Ahar, and Rashtra, Nadu, Kottam, or Vishay at different times and places. Rashtra and Vishay often figure as two categories, one larger than the other. In the Tamil country, the larger division was often called Valanadu and or Mandalam. The size of these units often depended on accidents of history, that is, Bhadraj Vishay of the Badami period. In this division, also there was an assembly of elders and a chief executive official known as Desh Bhojak and Nattukod, and so on. The provincial, here we see the provincial administration. The provincial office were often held by princes of the royal family, and this was an advantage where there was unity in the family, but when differences arose, it easily led to civil war and disruption. As for instance, in the Chalukya empire of Badami, during the interval between the death of Pulkeshi II and accession of Vikramaditya first, there were groups of officers charged with the maintenance of the peace and securing the safety of life and property, who went by different names in different kingdoms. Local policing was to some extent done by village officials. There were also bailiffs, and the bailiffs are the Shashan Sancharin, known as Sashan Sancharin in that language, and who went about the around the country, and enforcing the execution of the orders of government and the decrees of law courts. And they were aided in the discharge of their duties by a constabulary, the bhattas, and we here also a superintendent of the treasury, the koshadhyaksha, and officers engaged in the survey and assessment of cultivated land, nilakattar and adhikari. known as these are the official officers' name. And lastly, there were the Vail Ketpar, that is hearers of oral orders issued by the king, also called Rahasyadhikrit. They were the secretaries who attended on the king and listened to his orders and subsequently wrote them out in proper form and had them communicated to the official concerned for proper action. Such orders were called such orders were called Rajstravitam under the Chalukyas and Rashtrakutas. Beside village courts and caste and guild panchayats for the settlement of disputes, there were law courts also existed, and they are known as Adhikaranas and Dharmasasanas and maintained by the central government for the administration of justice, and they were presided by over by the state officials and assisted by the advisors learned in the law, known as dharmasana bhattas. A scene in the farce Mattavilas by King Mahendravarman suggests that the court were not altogether free from corruption, and in the absence of the other evidence ordeals known as Divya were resorted to for proof. There is no clear proof of the existence of a regularly constituted council of ministers, although the Mandri Mandal, the group of ministers, took part in the events preceding the coronation of Nandivarman II and Nandivarman II Pallavamal. The king was the head of the state, the fountain of honor and judge, the leader of the armed forces. The early kings in this period called themselves Dharma Maharaja Dhiraj in token of their active promotion of Vedic Dharma as against Buddhism and Jainism, which had made much headway in the country in the earlier periods. But there were Jaina monarchs also, and particularly among the Gangas, we found them. The kings especially favored the particular religious creed they professed, but never sought to impose it on all their subjects. Rather, they patronized as a matter of policy all the other creeds. So, after a political revolution, social and economic stability was ensured by the express proclamations that all pre-existing rights of property and the charitable foundations would be respected by the new rulers. The succession to the throne was usually hereditary in the eldest male line, and the princes were educated according to the best standard of the time in literature, law, philosophy, and the martial arts also, and trained in administrative positions suited to their capacities and tastes. The attempt of Mangalesh to shut Pulkesan II, for whom he acted as regent permanently, out of his rights, met with a deserved failure as public opinion supported Pulkesan. The success of Vikramaditya in checking the disruption of the Chalukya Empire after the death of Pulkesin II has also been noticed above, and Vikramaditya was not the eldest son of Pulkesin. So, the choice of Nandivarman II as king from the collateral branch when succession failed in the main line may also be recalled. The history of the Rashtrakuta and of the Eastern Chalukyas was marred by a number of disputed succession and civil wars. Among the later, this was accentuated by the interference of the Rashtrakutas. The choice of Govinda III for succession by Dhruva led inevitably to a civil war and started by his eldest son Kambha, whose claims had been passed over. But the event justified the choice of Govinda for each royal family had its own banner, that is called Dhwaja, and the seal, the Lakshana or Lanchana, the mentioned prominently in their inscriptions, and the royal palace was maintained in great state, and elephants and horse captured in war were exhibited at the palace gate. The queens occupied a position of equal importance with the king, and Shil Bhattarika, the Dhruva's wife, who bore the imperial titles Parmeshwari and Param Bhattarika, made grant of land at her own will and issued her own orders to the executive officers of government. The Rangpataka was the another lady, the wife of Pallav Rajsimha, interested herself in construction of the Kailashnath temple. Though the king was in theory an autocrat, there were several modifying factors in practice. All the members of the royal family shared in the administration as far as possible and had opportunities of influencing the king's policy. Then there were high officials of state, some of whose offices were hereditary and who commanded the respect of the monarch by their ability and character. The presence of numerous feudatory monarchs and the domination of social life by the numerous corporate organizations spoken of ever went far to mitigate the bad consequences of the rule of incapable and misguided sovereigns. So this is the political history of South India, including the Sangam Age also. And here I would like to conclude or in brief tells about the three empires. The first is the Chalukyas of Badami, and the founder of the Chalukyas of Badami, as per the sources, is the Jaisimha first, and the last is the Kirtivarman second in 744 AD to 550 sorry 744 AD to 755 AD. The next mighty empire in South India is the Pallavas. The founder of the Pallavas was the Singh Vishnu in 574 AD, and it they ruled in South India till the ruler Aparajita came, and in 879 AD. The Pandyas were the third who established their kingdom in 590 AD, and the founder of the kingdom is Kadungon in 590 AD, and it lasted uh, with the Maravarman Rajsimha II in 920 AD. So these are the political mighty empire who ruled the South India, and they evolved and they evolved South India culturally and enhanced the trade and commerce of that particular region. So when we talked about in the sphere of religion, as generally in all matters of spiritual, the culture South India began by being heavily indebted to the north, but in course of centuries it more than repaid the debt and made signal contribution single contribution to the theory and practice of religion and to the philosophic thought in its various aspects. Its saints and seers evolved a new type of bhakti, a fervid emotional surrender to God, which found its supreme literary expression in Bhagavad Puran. A bhakti very different from calm, dignified devotion of Bhagavatas of early centuries before and after Christ in northern India. And again from South India arose the two schools of Vedic exegesis, and these are known as Mimansa, that go by the names of Kumarila Bhatt and Prabhakara, uh, the founders of three main systems of Vedanta. That is, they are the Shankara, Ramanuja, and Madhava. So they also hailed from the southern country. And yet another prominent philosophical system, the Shav Siddhant, also found its exponents in the Tamil country, and lastly, the Vedas were commented on more than once in this part of the country, and the constant study of the ritual manuals of the different Vedic schools was kept up. The literature of these movements was reviewed in outline, and in the last chapter here, in the last, this is the last topic of our module. So here we shall seek to sketch the main stages in the history of these developments. So, till about the 5th century AD, harmony and tolerance characterized the relations between the different religious sects. The worship of primitive godlings and offerings of blood and toddy went on side by side with the performance of elaborate Vedic sacrifices. The popular pantheon included many deities like Murag, Shiv, Vishnu, Indra, Krishna, and others. Buddhists and Jains were found in considerable numbers in different parts of the country and following their practices without let or hindrance. In a story of Manimekalai, for instance, we find the heroic advice to study in Kanchi the philosophical system of the Vedas, and Shiv, Vishnu, Ajivika, Jaina, and Sankhya, Vaisheshika, and Lokayat. But soon a great change came, particularly in Tamil country, and people began to entertain fears of the whole land going over to Jainism and Buddhism. And at any rate, the worshipper of Shiva and Vishnu felt the call to stem the rising tide of heresy. The growth on the one hand of an intense emotional bhakti to Shiva or Vishnu, and on the other of an outspoken hatred of Buddhist and Jainas are the chief characteristics of this new era. So the challenges to public debate, the competition in the performance of miracles, and the tests of the truth of doctrines by means of ordeals became the order of the days. So the parties of devotees under the leadership of one gifted saint or another traverse the country many times over, that is singing, dancing, and debating all their way. This great wave of religious enthusiasm attained its peak in the early 7th century and had not spent itself in the middle of the ninth. Later, tradition counted 63 Nayanars. Nayanars are the Shiv devotees, individuals and collective, as the most prominent leaders of this revival on the side of the Shaivas. The individual included a woman from Karaikal and a Peria, Nadan from Adanur, beside a general of the Pallava forces, Sirutondar. But most prominent among them were the three great men whose hymns are collected together in the Devaram. And the first came Tirunuvukka Rashu, a Vellal from Tiruvamur, and most probably contemporary of the Pallava ruler Mahendravarman I. Though born in an Orthodox chef family, he was attracted to Jainism in early years and joined the Jaina monastery at Pataliputra as a monk. And his elder sister, who had watched his change of faith with untold regret, implored Shiva's help. Her prayer was answered, and Dharmsena, for that was her brother's name in monastery, became the victim of an incurable abdominal disorder. When all his fellow Jains failed him, he was compelled to go and seek his sister's aid. She secured his cure by the grace of God of Tiruvadigai, and the news of his defection greatly upset the Jaina monks of Patliputra, who trumped up many false charges against Dharmsena to poison the mind of Mahendravarman against him. He was subjected to many trials and tortures, which, however, by the grace of Shiva, he easily surmounted. Finally, the king himself was convinced of the superiority of Shaivism and embraced it. Whatever element of the truth there may be in the life story of Tirunavukarasu or Appar, which we have sketched above, a verse in the Trichunapoli inscriptions of Mahendra Varman furnishes clear proof that the king did indeed turn to Saivism from some other creed. It must, however, be admitted that the tradition regarding the persecution of Appar by Mahendravarman, whose name does not occur in the story narrated by Sekilar, is hard to reconcile with the spirit of the Matyavilas. The rest of Appar's long life of 81 years was spent in pilgrimages, during which he met many contemporary Nayanars, of whom Nana Sambadar was the most notable, indeed the greatest of them all. Nana Sambadar was a Brahmin of the Kaudinya Gotra and from Shiali in the Tanjore district. And there are a few Shiv temples in the Tamil country today where worship is not offered to him. So legend avers that as a child of 3, he got the milk of divine knowledge from Parvati herself and narrated the incident to his father in song. The father at once realized the divinity of his child and carried him on his shoulders from one chef's shrine to another until he was relieved by the present from the gods of a pearl palanquin for his son's use. At that time, the Pandya country was almost completely overrun by Jainism, and the Pandyan queen, a princess from the Chola country, and the minister uh, Kulachirai, both of whom were Shavas, and they sent Sambadar an urgent invitation to come and release the Pandya and his country from the tightening up grip of Jainism. The Nana Sambadar betook himself to Madurai and foiled all the conspiracies of the Jainas against him and vanquished them in the debate and converted the king and his subjects to Shaivism. The story goes that on this occasion, the 8,000 Jainas were put to death by impalement, and a festival in the Madurai temple is supposed to commemorate the gruesome event on this day. This, however, is little more than an unpleasant legend and cannot be treated as history. There is no reason to believe that even in those days of intense religious strife, intolerance descended to such cruel barbarities. Nor are we asked to believe the story of his marriage. It is said that when at the age of 16 he was married, the ceremony had hardly been completed when the newly wedded pair and all the wedding parties were absorbed into the Godhead. Sambadar had disputations with Buddhists also and visited many shrines and sang hundreds of hymns in his short lifetime. He was the purest of all the saints and with no past to regret. He may be placed in the middle of the 7th century, and his Pandyan contemporary was either Marvarvan Avni Sulemani and or his grandson Arikesri Marvarman. About a century later, Sundarmurti of Navalur, he was born of poor Brahman uh, parents, but his beauty as a child was such that he attracted the attention of local chieftain Narsinga Munai. The name is Narsinga Munaya Darayan, who, with the consent of the parents, brought him up with his marriage with a girl of his own caste, was, was about to take place, and it was stopped by the mysterious intervention of Shiva, who claimed him as his slave. A little later, Sundara fell in love with two women, once a dancing girl of Tiruvalur and the other is a Shudra girl of Tiruvariyur. Their jealousies, it's a sad that folk said that it is their jealousies could only be resolved by Shiva himself, acting as a messenger to one of them, and like the other Nayanar, Sundara is also credited with many miracles, and the contemporary Chera ruler, Chairman Perumal, was his friend. They visited each other regularly and made their last journey to the abode of Shiva in Mount Kailash together. Sundara on a white elephant and Chairman Perumal on a horse, and the Sundara's devotion to Shiva was that of an intimate friend, so that he was given the title Tambiran Tolan, the friend of God. A little later than Sundara came the illustrious Manika Vasagar, and the legend make him the minister of a Pandyan king. And on his account, Shiva, the presiding deity of Madurai, is said to have performed many miracles. His Pandyan contemporary was most probably Varaguna II, and Manika Vasagar is said to have debated with Buddhists from Ceylon. Uh, at Chidambaram and to have utterly vanquished them. So his hymns form the Tiruvasagam, the sacred word, and the another work Tirucharam Balakovai is also ascribed to him. The hymn of Sambadar, Appar, and Sundara form a varied treasure house of religious experience which tells of mystical ruptures and ecstasies of moments of light when there is a vision of God and the world in transfigured in light of His love, and the periods of gloom when all is dark and the blind seeker is filled with a sense of fear. Somewhat different and more exuberant are the outpouring of Manika Vasagar, whose confessions are more outspoken and whose devotion is more impassioned. And some of them were keen controversialists and had no soft word for Buddhists and Jains. So, when we talked about the Vaishnav wings, the Vaishnav wing of movement is represented by 12 alvars, and these are alvar, we can say the diverse into the qualities of God, for whom orthodox tradition gives an impossible chronology, and three of them, Poegai, Kodam, Pe, born respectively at Kachi, and Mallai, Malaipur, are believed to have come earliest. So, a beautiful legend tells how these three saints sheltered from rain in a narrow room, which could only just hold them standing when Vishnu himself came and seeking their company. The bhakti of these early saints is gentle, simple devotion, and altogether free from a sectarian outlook. This fact that their employment of the Varnava meter in their songs points to a really early date for them and not later than the 5th or 6th century AD. Then we came about the Tirumalisai, he born in village of that name in Chingalepur district, and most probably an elder contemporary of Pallava Mahenvarman first. The story goes that at birth he was a shapeless mass of flesh and abandoned by his parents and brought up by a Shudra. He is said to have practiced Jainism, Buddhism, and Shaivism before settling down finally a Vaishnav yogi, and his poems show a more controversial tone than those of the first three alvars, and this was quite natural to his age. So after him, we might place Tirumangai, and one of the most celebrated of alvars, and he was the pretty chieftains of Alinadu, and in the Tanjore district, who, according to legends, who became a highwayman in order to carry off the Mary, the daughter of a Vaishnavite doctor of a higher caste, and for whom he also changed his religion. He is said to have stolen a solid golden image of Buddha from a monastery in Negapatnam to pay for renovating the temple of Sri Rangam. The clear reference to Varameg is in his hymns places him in the middle of 8th century, a date which discredits the story of his friendly meeting with Nana Sambadar at Shiali. Neither story can be treated as history nor each in its own way furnishes a clue to what his followers believed in later time. His hymns, and they are many and equally full of good poetry and attack on Jainism and Buddhism. To Shaivism on whole, he evinced a more friendly attitude, and there are many resemblances in literary form and religious sentiments between Nana Sambadar and Tirumangai. A little later than Tirumangai, about the close of the 8th and beginning of the 9th century, came a number of Alvars Periyar, a Brahmin of Sri Villiputtur, won a religious disputation in the court of the Pandya king Sri Maharaj Sri Vallabh, and the only woman among them was the Andal or Kodai. The Sanskrit name is Goda, was the real or adopted daughter of Periyalvar. In her intense devotion to Vishnu, she dreamed of her marriage with that god and described her experience in her hymns. This mystical union was the only one she knew, and in many ways, the odor of her devotion resembles that of Manika Vasagar, and her hymns are replete with allusions to Krishna's stories. To about the same period belonged to Tiruppan, a minstrel of low caste who was not permitted to earlier to enter the temple of Sri Rangam and was thus the Vaishnav counterpart of Nandan and Tondar Adipodi, the dust of the feet of devotees. A Brahman from Tanjore district whose real name was Vipra Narayan and whose intolerance of Buddhism and Jainism was nearly as great as that of Tirumangai. Kulshekhara, the ruler of Kerala, was the proficient alike in Sanskrit and Tamil and was the next Alvar, and who, among other shrines of Vishnu, sang of those at Chidambaram and at Tiruvali, the later, no doubt a foundation of Tirumangai. Lastly came then celebrated Nammalvar and his people Madhura Kavi. The former was born of the Vella family of Alvar Tirunagari, also called Kurgur, in the Tinnevelly district. His personal name was his another name was Maran, and he seems to have gained the name Satkopa on the occasion of his initiation. He renounced the world in his 35 years to practice yoga. His hymns, the largest in number after those of Tirumangai, are rightly regarded as embodying the deepest religious experience and philosophical thought of one of the greatest seer of the world. So, Wan Seng, who visited South India in 642 AD when the Hindu revival was just gathering momentum, did not notice the new movement. Although, in speaking of Maharashtra, he mentioned the worshipper of Dev. The Dev means here the Shiva, who covered themselves with ashes, and he mentions with regret that his own creed, the Buddhism, was on the decline, and he remarks repeatedly that it had yielded to Digambara Jainism. The triumph of the revivalist movement was largely achieved in the 2 centuries that followed, and the public disputations which led kings and rulers to transfer their allegiance from one creed to another did much to bring this about. And more important was the use of the popular speech by Nainars and the Alvars in their soul stirring compositions, and the fact that they were set to simple tunes which the masses loved to sing. Another important, though less popular, aspect of the same revival is seen in the work of Kumarila and Shankara. They were Smartas, the traditionalists, who labored in the cause not of anyone sect in particular, but the ancient Brahmanical religion as it had been developed through the centuries. They held up as the religious ideal, a youth occupied and religious and ritual observances followed by an old age given up to philosophic contemplations. Kumarila frequently attacks Buddhism in his works, and tradition asserts that he did much to discredit them in the course of his many scholarly journey. So he elucidated the philosophy of ritualism, the Mimamsa, the philosophy of Mimamsa in all its aspects. But Shankara was the greater thinker, and few details of his life are very well attested. But he generally taken to the Namudari Brahman from Kaladi on the banks of the Alway River in North Travancore, where he was born in 788 AD. He lost his father early in the life and turned ascetic with Govind a yogi, uh, a pupil of Gaudapada as his guru. And in a short life, he traveled all over India and propagating his new philosophy of a rigorously consistent monism and triumphing against all rivals who met him in the debate. He reorganized the ascetic order of Hinduism uh, on the model of the Buddhist order, and founded a number of mathas in different parts of India, the best known being those at Shringeri, Dwarika, Badrinath, Puri, and Kanchi. His philosophy, which traces all apparent multiplicity and difference to illusion, that is Maya, is indeed derived from the Upanishads, but clearly owes much in detail to Mahayanist speculations. And nevertheless, he regarded Buddhism as Hinduism's chief enemy. Within a few years, Within a few years of his death in 820 AD, one of his people, Shiv Som, was spreading his doctrine in distant Kambuj across the seas, and not without justice. It has been said that Shankara would have a higher place among the famous names of the world had not his respect for tradition and prevented him from asserting the originality which he undoubtedly possessed. So, the work of the poet saints of the Pandya Pallava period was continued in the age of Cholas by a succession of poets and teachers of second ring. The Tamil hymns of the last age came to be treated as equal to the Veda and were collected and arranged in canonical books. Gradually, they were regularly employed in the daily worship in temples, and their authors came to regularly worshipped as manifestation of divinity. In fact, the rise of the temple to an important place in the religious and social life of the land was direct result of the revivalist movement. The age of the imperial Cholas saw the construction of stone temples, great and small, and they varied in size in almost every town and village in their extensive empire. The great temples of Tanjore and Gangaikonda Cholampuram were symbolic to New Age, and among many others, they were celebrated in hymns by contemporary poets. So this is the about the revivalist, or we can say the religious movements that happened in the South India during the Sangam Age and the ancient India. From here onwards, we will took this topic tomorrow and in the next lecture. So I hope you all would like this lecture, and if you have any question, please let me know in the comment box. Later you can in later you can also comment them here. So if you have any questions, ask me please. Okay, there is I think there is no questions, and thank you for such a patience. And we will take this from here onwards, we will take this topic tomorrow. So, and we will continue the South Indian history, and end up in tomorrow. And tomorrow will be I will uh, announce the quiz and assignments. So please attend all the quizzes and assignments. And thank you all.